I'm Katja Donovan, Chief Officer at 1014, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th episode of Resilience and Adaptation, a new series of events brought to you by 1014 and the American Council on Germany. Each week, we're joined by experts from both sides of the Atlantic to talk about the pressing challenges that are emerging around the globe.
And I'm Steve Sokol, the President of the American Council on Germany. The corona crisis has created a tremendous challenge for people and societies. We are grappling with high unemployment, lack of access to healthcare, shortages of consumer goods, social and emotional stress. And it is evident that the crisis has hit some people harder than others. How does civil society respond to these challenges? And what role does philanthropy play in helping deal with an unprecedented situation? To talk about this today, we're delighted to have Nina Lemmens and Daniela Kaisth with us for the discussion. Thank you both for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Daniela Kaisth is founder and president of Gratias Partners, a philanthropy advisory firm that helps donors to give more effectively and nonprofits to develop new initiatives through collaboration and high-impact philanthropy. She has over 25 years of experience working at the nexus of civil society and philanthropy. Daniela served as Vice President of Development at the East-West Institute and spent a decade as a Vice President at the Institute of International Education, or IIE. Dr. Nina Lemmens was appointed member of the Executive Board of the Joachim Herz Stiftung as of October 1st, 2018. In this role, she's responsible for the 3 central program areas: science, economics, and personal development. Previously, Nina held various positions at the German Academic Exchange Service, or DAAD, starting in 1997. Most recently, she served as director of the DAAD's North America office in New York.
We would like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, non-partisan organizations. So the views expressed during this conversation are those of the 2 experts. And if you would like to ask questions, please use the chat function on Zoom. You can also send an email to Steve using the address sokol@acgusa.org. And we will integrate your questions into the conversation.
While the current environment may be one of the most difficult for civil society, it also underscores the critical role local actors play in keeping communities together. So let's begin by talking briefly about the role of civil society in Germany and the United States in this unprecedented time. Nina, let's start with you. In Germany, how did civil society respond to the lockdown? And what has changed as things go back to normal?
Well, I think like everybody around the world, also civil society and philanthropy was firstly totally shocked, and they kind of halted and didn't maybe quite know what to do. But then people very quickly sprung into action. More or less overnight, you could see all kind of, for example, neighborly help blossoming across the country. And I think that's something that we have seen also in other European countries, like offers to go shopping for neighbors who couldn't or wouldn't want to leave the house, for example, or reading books to elderly people over the phone because the nursing homes were locked down, or just to name a few examples. Most independent private foundations like the Joachim Herz Foundation were, like everybody, also taken off guard, I have to say. We had to act very quickly because we were going to send a group of young adults who are doing an apprenticeship here in Germany to the US, and they were about to fly out on March 12th, which was 2 days before the US government prohibited incoming travel. Luckily, I pulled the plug just the 2 days ahead. So we were all very, very busy. But then, of course, we thought, so what can we do? And I think most foundations, or very many private foundations, did the same as we did. They started to work with the partners they had always worked with. So we, for example, asked the partners that we normally sponsor, what do you need? How can we help? And we set up, and I think many others did the same, very easy application processes so that they could come up and ask us for help, for example, for devices that they can then use for children, for example, for teaching or for learning, homeschooling. That was something that could easily be done fairly easily because you had to buy these devices and there was a shortage. I think must have been the same everywhere. But I think that was something that everybody did. So to focus on their usual partners and help them, because we also want them to be there when this whole crisis is gone. And very often these are organizations that don't have big funds themselves. So it's very important to support them and to help them stay alive, more or less. So, for example, there was a big campaign here in Hamburg organized by the major newspaper to collect money to give it to people for food stamps. And by now, more than 1.3 million euros have been collected, and more than 53,000 food stamps have been given out to people. And there were, everybody was willing to chip in. Big companies, supermarkets, just as well as ordinary people who just gave a little bit of money. So this is maybe just an example of what has happened. But when you ask how it is now that things are back to normal, I think nothing is back to normal yet, quite honestly. I mean, we have, after the 7 weeks of the very more or less strict lockdown, which wasn't a lockdown, but we were supposed not to leave the house, basically just for shopping, doctor, and we were able to go for walks. The whole of Germany seems to be walking or jogging at the moment. But the situation is not back to normal. If you just look at the schools or kindergartens, they are opening slowly, but still very patchy, and it's very hard for parents to deal with homeschooling and working at the same time. So that's a major burden. I can see that also with my colleagues who try the best, and they really work very hard, but they are not trained teachers, obviously. And then also, just to mention one more thing, is the whole realm of cultural institutions. They have been closed since mid-March, and I don't know when they will be able to open again. And of course, they are lacking the income that they normally rely on. So it's same holds true for universities. They all had to start teaching online. So it's not back to normal at all, unfortunately.
So obviously there are lots of different institutions that sort of serve as the glue that holds civil society together. And you've talked a little bit about some of those, whether it's schools, universities, museums, cultural entities, but also churches and other organizations that really, play an important role in keeping communities alive. And I'd like to maybe switch to you, Daniela, to talk a little bit about what's going on in civil society in the US, or at least what some of your observations are. Obviously, different communities have responded very differently. But it would be very interesting, I think, for us to hear, even if it's anecdotal, some of the observations that you have, and maybe some of the similarities between what Nina was talking about and some of the things that you've seen.
Sure, thank you, Steve. And thank you to ACG and 1014 for putting this series together. I think the series itself is an example of the type of adaptation that nonprofits and the civil society sector are doing to help in this crisis. So in the United States, the coronavirus has produced a lot of suffering, of course, as it has all around the world. And I think the encouraging thing is seeing the outpouring of assistance from civil society. Very similar to what Nina was talking about. And from my perspective, when you look at civil society, what we're talking about is not government necessarily, not the business sector, but ordinary people on the one hand, so a bottom-up type approach. And on the other hand, the organized institutions of philanthropy, foundations, nonprofit, etc., which are more like top-down. So top-down, foundations have really responded with relief funds and also reducing restrictions on grants and having a call to do better in philanthropy and to help more. So that's been extremely encouraging, but of course it's their job to do that. What I have found very inspirational are the stories of ordinary American citizens turning out to help. And we see this everywhere, as Nina said, from neighborly assistance to kind of more organized and very innovative, creative programs. And two I wanted to tell you about. One is called COVID Sitters. So this was featured in the New Yorker recently, where a group of medical students at the University of Minnesota, they saw that while they were sort of on a break from school, their mentors and their teachers at the hospital were working 15-hour shifts and then having to stand in line to buy diapers for their kids. So they started a volunteer group called COVID Sitters, and they matched volunteers from the community with families on the front lines, not just doctors and nurses, but including cleaners at the hospital and cafeteria workers and so on, to provide childcare and shopping help. And so this is a very interesting bottom-down approach. But what happened next shows a little bit how civil society organizations can then achieve more scale. And what happened next was that the governor of Minnesota declared childcare to be free for all healthcare workers in the state. So this group took the donations that they had received. They continued to do matching with the volunteers and families to fill in gaps, but anything extra they gave to food banks and to homeless shelters. And then what they also did was they shared their plan with 150 medical schools around the United States, 30 of which ended up starting chapters of COVID Sitters. So that's one really interesting example of civil society not only stepping up, but scaling up. And another great example closer to home that I wanted to highlight, at least for us in New York, is Feed the Frontlines NYC. And this started with a phone call to a restaurant family, a family that owned 5 Italian restaurants in New York City, from a friend in Canada who said, is there any way I can help your restaurant and help NYU Langone Emergency Department? I have a friend there, they're inundated with cases. And so what Feed the Frontlines did was deliver 20 dinners to NYU Langone. And this was maybe in mid-March. So 20 dinners to NYU Langone has since become a program that has delivered over 100,000 meals to 75 institutions in the New York City area, not just hospitals, but now they have pivoted strategically to provide meals to people in transitional housing in New York City. And again, what have we seen from the New York City government? We've seen a pledge to add 1 million more meals per day to what the New York City government is doing and to work with nonprofits to help. So we see the government coming in here to civil society, and then we see replication. So the giving group that I belong to replicated this program. We had one of our members whose mother owned a Korean restaurant in Queens. And so we gathered the funds so that she could keep cooking and delivering to hospitals in Brooklyn and Queens. And then we started a GoFundMe campaign. Ji-Young Choi did, the leader of this effort, and that raised additional funds. So in this way, you can see how the energy, enthusiasm of just ordinary citizens doing good work percolates outwards and really is a strength for society in this dark time.
And Daniela, I think what you're describing, I've heard stories about this from across the country of local communities supporting local restaurants so that they can make donations to essential workers, but to others in need as well. I mean, what you're describing is not just an isolated example, but it seems to be one where it throws a lifeline to the restaurants, but it really also throws a lifeline to the community at large. One follow-up question for you, though. As we sort of start to come out from the lockdown, and obviously different parts of the US are emerging in different ways, has anything changed, or is it too early to tell?
I agree with Nina that the needs are still very great. And I think what we've seen is that the inequality that has come out to light as a result of this crisis is a very systemic thing. And so I think we're going to see civil society groups continuing their work, but perhaps shifting from maybe this direct relief to more systemic solutions, and also, as we discussed, the groups helping restaurants around the country, the restaurants, as the medical needs become less, starting to feed other vulnerable populations in the United States.
Can I
Sorry, Nina?
because I think what Daniela said is also true here. You can see that some of the problems that were already there have now been like under the magnifying glass. They are, they are much more, you are much more aware of them. And I would just like briefly to go back to my example for the digital devices, or for the devices to use digital ways to communicate for school children, because we have seen that this is, it's a problem. Not every school child has an iPhone, or has a phone, or has a computer, or has Wi-Fi, stable Wi-Fi. And we also have seen that not only is it the device itself that is lacking, but it's also the support to use, how to use it. And that's something that has been a problem in Germany before, because Germany doesn't have a very good track record in as regards to being equal with the chances of participating in education. We have had, in fact, a bad track record here. So in other words, if you come from an affluent background, you will normally have a lot of support if you go to school, and your parents will be able to help you and support you, and maybe pay for a tutor if necessary. But if you don't come from an affluent background, you don't have the support, or if you have children who are not fluent in German themselves, it's difficult for them. And all these problems that have been there before have now really been magnified, so to say. And I think that's something that showed us where the problems are, and that we really have to solve them. And I think that civil society can help there, but it's also basically in Germany, it's also a big task for the structures that are sponsored by the government and the Länder, the state.
So Nina, since you brought up the issue of technology, we have a viewer question that pivots a little bit from what you're talking about, but technology plays a central role to it. And he writes, social capital in Germany is considered fairly high. Usually it's associated with membership in associations and greater social cohesion. I wonder if technology, i.e. online connections, is undermining Germany's social capital, and what that means for the country.
Wow, that's a difficult question. I think personally, if I look at the way that I've been working for the last nearly 3 months now, basically online, very, very much online, I think the thing that amazed me most was that it's possible, and that it was possible very quickly, that we all changed to this kind of work. So there still is like cohesion in a way, but I guess it's the same for you as well. What is really lacking and what is missing is everything that normally happens when you go to a meeting. You talk before, you actually sit down and discuss the topic, and you have a coffee break and you discuss something. So anything, normally you say the most important things at any conference are the breaks, because there's where the action happens and where creativity happens, where you meet people that you relate to and that you come up with ideas together. And I think that's missing, and that's maybe something, if this should go on for a longer time, which I really don't hope, that would also make it more difficult to have this cohesion, because then everybody is in their echo chamber and they only talk to the people they know. So I think the kind of conversation that we're having right now, it works because in this case we foreknow each other, which is really great. But if you don't know somebody, it's really hard to start a conversation and to start producing something, be it an idea or a concept or whatever. And that's not good for social cohesion. That's what I would say. So I think we have all learned that these devices and the techniques are amazing, and I think they will stay on a much larger scale than we thought before possible. But we also realized what it can't do. And I think social interaction is so important. And I personally, I miss my colleagues. I miss the colleagues in my foundation. I miss everybody else that I normally meet. And I not only miss them because I like people, but because I like this intellectual exchange that is not happening as easily via Zoom as it would be via a coffee break. Is that an answer to the question?
Thank you. Yes.
Perfect. And let's perhaps switch gears a little and hone in on some of these social inequalities that we've now started to talk about. And as both of you said, the Corona crisis appears to have magnified these social inequalities, and that's certainly true in both Germany and the United States. And Daniela, you also said, this might be something in the future that civil society and philanthropy have to take a look at. But what do you think? Have the pre-existing structures been able to fill the void to deal with these social inequalities that are now so prevalent? I don't know who wants to start.
Daniela, you go first.
Sure. I would say the answer is no. The existing social structures have not been able to address the inequalities as they are. However, there's been a lot of adaptation. There's been a lot of pivoting. There's an article by Jim Bidner, who's a foundation CEO, and he talks about what current institutions have done. And he talks about pop-ups, pop-outs, and push-throughs. I think this is a really interesting way to look at it. So yes, there is so much inequality that's been brought into stark relief by the pandemic. The digital divide is one of them, really. There are various statistics floating around, but one I heard recently was that as much as 27% of Americans do not have access to high quality, fast internet at home. So when you think about what that means in terms of inequality, that really widens the divide greatly when kids are working from home. Those kids are going to be far behind the ones without fast internet. So what have current institutions done? So pop-ups, some example of a pop-up is that in San Francisco, right after the lockdown happened, a group formed something called a digital bridge. And what they did was they just simply purchased free high-speed internet for tens of thousands of the poorest students in San Francisco. So this is a way that an institution has adapted by starting something new. There have been plenty of pop-outs. Pop-outs are, if you have a school that's empty and there are childcare needs for healthcare workers, boy, you could put those kids in that school and hire volunteers. That's a great pop-out that I've seen all across the country. And then the third category is the push-through. So I thought this was a great way of talking about institutions and civil society, and including business and government, that are trying to adapt and do new things and change things to enable us to push through this very difficult time. And everyone has seen examples of this. Mortgage companies, insurance companies, accepting delayed payments, rent, being accepted late as well, or free or reduced licenses, or free or reduced media coverage. So foundations especially have really tried to do push-throughs by, for example, removing restrictions on funding, so that if you've just gotten a big grant for a program, you could also use it for unrestricted support. So I think inequality is much more visible than it used to be, and I really don't think we were prepared before this, but there's been adaptation to help.
Okay, maybe, sorry, Nina, before you answer that from the German perspective, just picking up on the digital divide, we have another viewer question that also is curious about that. And the question reads as follows. So I'm wondering how the gap between the digitalized children and the ones who do not have access to any digital devices or access for education will affect German society in total. I'm very worried about the future of this neglected group of children. So Daniela, you just laid out the picture in the US, and I'm sure, Nina, there's something to say about that, how it is in Germany as well.
I mean, we have a major digitization plan for German schools here in Germany that should have been put into action a while ago, because it was decided a while ago. You know, that one has to, I maybe have to explain that education is something that is not dealt by on the federal level, but on the Länder, so the state level. It's very important to know. It has to do something with our history. So they are equipped with a lot of money in the so-called digital pact, so to say, to provide internet and internet access throughout every school, and not necessarily a personal device. That's something that's, you know, up to the person. But it's very simple. It's very similar to what Daniela said. Also here, you could see a lot of initiatives where we, for example, we provided money to buy SIM cards for students who needed access. For example, also in homes where migrants live, because they might have just very, very bad internet access. And as I said before, we also provided for our partners that we work with anyway, funds to buy tablets or laptops for school children, to either give it to them completely or so that they can borrow it for the time being. And it's, as I said, it's a very, very important topic, and it is made so much clearer right now that we have to work on this. But it's not only the digital devices. Right now, of course, that's very important, that you need to have this to be able to take part in the homeschooling. But it's the bigger picture is really that we need to take care of the children who don't have the same access or the same support from home, and not because the parents don't want to give it, but because they are, for whatever reason, maybe not able to give it. And that's something that we really have to work on. As foundations, you can try to do a lot of things. We, for example, have our oldest program. We're not a very old foundation, but this is our oldest program, which is going to be 10 years old next year, is a program where we support per year 90 to 100 school children from the year of 13, 14 years on to the finish of their high school, to their high school diploma, with a small stipend, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we invite them to seminars, and that's what we call the personal development. We help them to, they all have to have some kind of potential. They have to be able to show it to us, and then we help them to develop this. And that's something that is really necessary to do for children who don't have this natural support at home. So in short, it's not only the digital device, it's the whole system that children need support.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Daniela, as well. I'd like to stick with this issue of the digital divide and education for one more moment, because we have another viewer question, or actually it's more of a comment, but I'd like your response, each of you to respond to this comment. The viewer writes, "My concern is one that the panelists allude to, the digital divide. It was recently announced that foundations like the Gates Foundation have worked with New York government to, quote, reimagine education, end quote. My fear is that foundations like Gates are using COVID as an opportunity to unilaterally define not so much initiatives, but policy, in this case, educational policy, without civic input and to the detriment of a democratic system." Again, Nina, you alluded to the fact that the education system is structured differently in Germany. It's structured at the state level, and state government plays a huge role. But I'd be interested in hearing from both of you whether or not you're concerned that COVID-19 is serving as a catalyst for certain large foundations to influence policy?
Well, if I maybe start, is that okay, Daniela? I think you have to remember that the systems are very different in Germany and the US. And in Germany, most of the basic services, like for example, education, are catered for by the governments. So we have basically free schools, private schools. There are some, but it's by far not the majority, it's the minority. So education is something that is education, health service, universities, that's all dealt with by the governments, by the states. So foundations don't have that influence, even if they wanted to, and I think they don't want to have this influence here. They want to be able, or what they do, what foundations like mine do, is that we sponsor, for example, research in certain areas that are important to us. In our case, it's medicine, engineering, and law. But that's always an add-on. So the basic research is sponsored by the government, and the government pours a lot of money into this. So I think that that danger that the participant is seeing there it's not a danger for Germany, I would say, because the system is totally different. We pay a lot of taxes. We have a lot of how do you call it? Sozialabgaben, help me here.
Social welfare payments.
Right. And the money, every job holder has to pay this, and the money then is used by the government to support the systems like unemployment relief and healthcare and so on, and education. So it's a completely different system than the United States.
Daniela, any thoughts from you on that statement?
Yes. So foundations do seek to influence public policy in the United States. It's a deliberate strategy. About 750 foundations have signed a call to action pledge put out by the Council on Foundations to do a bunch of things in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Some of it is pretty recognizable, like more grants, reducing restrictions, better communications with grantees. But one of the things it says in the pledge is to try to influence public policy. So yes, foundations do try to do this, and it's a deliberate strategy because the funding that a government has is so much greater than a private foundation. So a great example is the Head Start program in the United States, which is a program to provide poor kids with very high quality preschool education, was started years ago by the Ford Foundation as a private philanthropic initiative, an experiment. Once they got the good data and passed it along to the government, states began to replicate it. The federal government put it in its plans, and that reached so many more children than could ever be reached by a private foundation. And now the president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, was an early participant when he was 2 or 3 years old in the Head Start program in rural Georgia, I believe. So it's not the issue of affecting public policy. I think that is the challenge here. It's how to ensure that citizen participation is in that process, and that's absolutely right. And it is very much a challenge to our democratic process. It's also a challenge of philanthropy. So much philanthropy traditionally has been top-down paternalistic work that doesn't even ask the people the foundation or the charity or the nonprofit is trying to help what they want and need. So I think the person who asked that question is putting his or her finger exactly on one of the points where philanthropy has to change, which is incorporating the views of the people that are trying to be helped. In other words, the families and students in the New York City public school system, and asking them what they think and what they need.
So we have a follow-up question, interestingly enough, from a 1014 board member who writes, all this volunteerism and philanthropy is great, but it seems like a stopgap. What signs do you see that systematic change could happen? I think it fits right in with what we're talking about right now.
And go ahead. No, okay. Go ahead.
It's true. A lot of this is stopgap piecemeal work. I do see signs, though, that systemic change could happen. One is that, civil society in the United States, I think people have recognized the impact of this crisis upon ordinary people. So many people have said to me, I didn't realize how many Americans live paycheck to paycheck. I didn't realize how many Americans were very much at the brink of disaster. I didn't realize that, of course, when you lose your job in a pandemic, you lose health insurance for your entire family. So I think there's been a recognition like never before of systemic problems. Now, how that gets solved, boy, if I knew that, maybe I would be president too. But how does that then work its way into changes in public policy? I just know the examples from what citizens have done in a charitable and philanthropic way, what foundations have done, have often led the way by showing on a very small scale what can be accomplished by addressing a problem, and getting policymakers to think about then addressing root causes of that problem. So I think that's another putting the finger on a very difficult topic in philanthropy. And foundations have started to recognize this by more and more making grant making, not just alleviating the immediate suffering of people, but looking at the systems that makes that suffering happen, and looking at touch points where they can maybe adjust the system, usually by working with the larger actors or all of the stakeholders, including governments, to make the system more fair and equitable.
And Nina, any thoughts on this volunteerism and philanthropic initiative serving as a stopgap, and whether systemic change is possible?
As I said before, the system is different here, and it's also, I have to say, much smaller. I mean, compared to the US, the foundations in Germany have much less power, even if you compare it, even relatively speaking, if you compare sizes of countries and so on. So I think what is an important role for foundations here is to fill in certain gaps that governments cannot fill in. So, for example, to be sometimes more innovative, to try out things, and then, but always work with, let's say, the school system. That's, for example, what we do. We ask them, what do you need? And we develop things together. And then, like Daniela said, then the model that we might have sponsored will hopefully be taken up by the school. And very often that's exactly what we want and what we discuss in the beginning when we start negotiating with them, and then making a contract that they can then make use of it and then also scale it up and use it for other school systems in other of the federal states here in Germany. So I think that's a very, very important role that we can fill in. We can try out things. We are not regulated as much. And yeah, I think what Daniela said is most important, and that's something that would have happened in a few weeks' time. That is that you have to talk amongst each other, and that you have to talk to the people that you want to work with, and also the ones that you want to somehow help is maybe the wrong way, but that you want to support, so that you are not in this old paternalistic way, just giving money to, doing good in the way that you think you're doing good, but that you really reach a goal that is really something that is needed by the society. And normally we would have had in 4 weeks the so-called Deutsche Stiftungstag, where all the foundations come together and discuss their projects and their programs, and also discuss it with politics, with all our stakeholders. And unfortunately, this can't happen this year, which is really sad, because I think this exchange of ideas is very, very important, because only through this exchange we know what is needed and where we can step in. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but I think that communication is of utmost importance here. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, construction going on outside. So this is really, I think, interesting. Talking about the problem of piecemeal approach or communication. So during this crisis, we know that governments spend so much money on recovery funds, right? So in the U.S., I think we're talking almost about $2 trillion, and this is certainly unprecedented. And in this environment, of course, we're wondering sort of how can the private sector ensure that their funds are spent in a strategic way when there's already so much money pouring out? And so how do you make sure it's directed in the right way to make an impact, to make a difference? And when you look, this is one question, and when you look at the stimulus bill, for example, in the US, it provides for a 100% tax deduction for donations to charities. So you can still see that, while the government is pouring out so much money, it's still encouraged for the private sector to pour out even more money. So how do you ensure that the impact is really where it needs to be, and that is really complementing or making a difference? Maybe Daniela, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I think it comes down to what is the role of private contributions when there's so much government support, and as you said, how do you make them as strategic as possible? I think that, as Nina has been saying, there is great room here for innovation and for pushing the boundaries in a way that government cannot and will not do. So that's really the role of the private sector, whether it's with business or philanthropy or private citizen groups, which is to come up with innovative ideas to address problems and even address systemic problems, and to bring those to the fore and to be change makers and enthusiastic leaders. And there are ways to be very strategic with those funds that are quite tried and true. One way and a principle of high impact philanthropy is simply to take a step back and to think about what is the social impact that you're trying to make with your funds. And then look at who else is doing the same and how you can work together. So collaboration is really, really important in this sector, and is a way that many funders can make their funds go so much further. And an interesting development I have seen in this pandemic is the collaboration between private foundations and the general public. So for example, I saw a presentation by the Windover Foundation last week, where they, with $50,000 of their own capital, started a mask making program when masks were so much in short supply. And then as they launched that program, they launched a GoFundMe campaign that raised $25,000. So I thought that is a really interesting way for private donors to be more strategic about their giving, to really step back and examine what they're trying to achieve, and then to reach out and work with others.
I would like to add an example of a project that we are working on at the moment, and that has to do with science journalism. It's not something that my foundation is normally working in this field, but as we are supporting science, we think it's very important that science is also communicated very well. So we have, long before Corona, I have to say, we have started discussing this topic with various other foundations. And this, for example, is a very good example for something where the government cannot sponsor anything, because if government starts sponsoring journalism, that's dangerous. So we don't want that, obviously. We want free journalists and free press. But private foundations that are, free of any kind of political connections and so on, they can maybe do this. And science journalism certainly needs support, because I think it's the same in the States. Like here in Germany, it's struggling very much. On the one hand, right now, everybody's reading the science pages about COVID-19, and the biggest star in German media right now is the top virologist of the Berlin Charité, who has a podcast that is listened to by millions of people every day. But on the other hand, the budgets are still cut because there is not enough income, for example, for newspapers because they don't have any ads anymore. So to sponsor good science journalism is something that a government can do, but that private foundations can do. And if we were to do this, we are still thinking about this, we would only do it, like Daniela said, together with other foundations, because this is something that needs the support of a large group of private and independent entities that would support this. And I think it's a good example for something where we certainly don't want any government influence.
Okay, and just to pick up on that, so you just said there's certainly something you don't want the government to fund and to get engaged, but does that go the other way around too? So are there some limits for private foundation where you say, woo, you know, this is the role of the government and don't interfere. This is, you know, should be off limits, or this should be a public sector responsibility, and we don't want to take the burden off the public sector. So do you see any limits for private engagement? Daniela, do you want to start with that?
Maybe this is an area where there's some difference with Germany. Nina can tell us, but I think in the United States there isn't so much the mentality of, oh, the state is going to take care of this, the government is going to take care of it. I think it's more of a mentality of the private sector being innovative and trying to push forward some solutions that maybe the government wouldn't necessarily get behind as a model. And you know, one example that I've been thinking of in particular that ties a little bit together what we've been talking about is the effect of the pandemic on communities of color in the United States. How much inequality there is and how much the pandemic has disproportionately affected these communities. One thing that the private sector and foundations have supported in recent years is developing community leaders from those same communities. So, you know, you need to really have the people you are serving be the leaders of your effort. And that is something that I've seen very clearly. And I have seen that changed in the course of my own career, where when I'm working with different nonprofits, you know, that the leadership of them now comes from within those communities. So that's, I think, an example of how maybe the private sector sees an inequality, sees an opportunity for systemic change, and deliberately tries to develop leaders in that sector in a way that the government would not be able to do. And yet the ramifications are very great for the public sector as well, because when you develop community leaders, they end up running not just nonprofits in your communities, but hospitals, universities, and also parts of the government.
So as we start to come to a close, I'd like to maybe ask two viewer questions, and if we have time, Katja and I have a final closing question for both of you. One of our viewers has written, the coronavirus is not just a health crisis, it is also an economic and political crisis. I think all of us would agree about that. Nonprofits are traditionally urged to remain apolitical. Has that been difficult at this time? And what are the challenges for nonprofits to address public problems that are caused by political decisions? How do you deal with these challenges, and how do those nonprofits remain apolitical? Daniela, you're nodding your head, so why don't you start with that, and then Nina, we'll ask you the same question.
Yes, it is a big challenge in the United States. Our society is extremely polarized at the moment. And yet, I think that many nonprofits and foundations are, I wouldn't say becoming political necessarily, but becoming more courageous in identifying the factors that are leading to inequality and lack of social justice in the United States and lack of environmental protection. How do you do that without becoming political? I can tell you about a bit of work with the ACLU. Here's a good example. Of course, you would imagine the ACLU to be very political, but they do have a mandate not to be so. And yet, Anthony Romero has talked about how he feels it would really be very detrimental for the ACLU in this era in US history not to step up and try to defend civil liberties as actively as possible. So I think nonprofits find ways, creative ways to, for example, not step into influencing voting in any way for or against, for example, but make it easier for, as I said, communities of color or immigrants or migrants to vote, because that is their right. So I think it is tricky, but I think civil society has a real role to play in correcting injustices in our society. And if that means calling political leaders on it, then that's what they should do.
And Nina, any thoughts on the nonpartisan nature of nonprofits and foundations?
Well, I cannot speak for the foundations that are connected to any political party. Obviously, they will be partisan, I think. But to the majority, I think, I think in a way, I think that's also what Daniela said. Every move that you make is in a way political. If you act in a social sphere, you're in a way acting politically because you are addressing certain problems or topics. So if, for example, we work a lot with the schools, not only here in Hamburg, but also in other parts of Germany, and we address certain problems that we see. We have already, long before Corona, we have worked in the digital sphere a lot with the schools. Then, of course, we are pushing our partners in this case, let's say, Hamburg school system, very much to improve things, and that's in a way a political statement. It's not like standing there and saying you have to do this and that and the other, but it's developing, as I said, in conversation, that there are certain lacks and that we have the feeling this is something that we would like to change and to help with. And I think that's also a political statement. It should not be a party political statement. Is that the right way? So not partisan. I think that's something that we, for example, would not do. But of course, we are acting in a political way when we address the fact that a lot of school children don't have the necessary support or the necessary digital devices. Then we are addressing inequalities, and that's a political statement in a way, but always with trying to be constructive and trying to solve it at the same time. That's something that we, at least I can only speak here from my foundation, that we find very important. We are a member of a group of 8 big foundations who have formed something called Forum Bildung Digitalisierung, which is a forum for digital education, so to say. And there we try to come up with solutions for schools and not lecture anybody, but by helping to create solutions and providing solutions, I think we are acting politically.
We have a great question from a viewer that really underscores the transatlantic nature of the work of both 1014 and the American Council on Germany. And the question reads as follows. In your opinion, how could champions of civil society in the United States and Germany work together to strengthen cooperation across the Atlantic and increase the relevance of a strong civil society sector at a global level? Daniela, why don't you start with that, and then Nina, and then we'll come back to Katja with a closing question to both of you.
Sure. I think this is a really important question, and one that I've been hearing about in one way or another since I've been telling people about this talk. I think there's great opportunity to work together and collaborate and share information. Nina talked about the group of foundation officials that were meeting in Germany. I think they should join with foundation officials in the United States. and I think include people from other countries as well. I think there's a lot of commonality in how civil society has helped move us all forward in this pandemic. And those really reach across countries, they reach across the US and Germany and the whole transatlantic relationship and the world. And so I think sharing those best practices and learning from each other is really very, very important, and collaborating where we can. So I think it's a great suggestion to use civil society to share ideas and information among countries.
Yeah, I think we are making a start at this very moment. And as Daniela and I have met when I was still in New York, we have started this conversation a long time ago. She was my teacher, actually. So in this whole, getting into this new realm of foundations. And there are some organizations here in Europe that are combining European foundations. There's the European Foundation Center, which would have met last weekend, actually, if Corona hadn't happened. And there's also something called Daphne. It's another group of foundations. I'm not sure if they are also connected to the ones in the US, but I guess there must be links. And I can only support what you have just said. We should definitely try to work across the Atlantic. I mean, I'm an old transatlantic person, so it's I'm open for it. And Daniela already have plans for the future. So watch this space.
That sounds really great. And just super brief, given this conversation, it would be really great to get your final thoughts and to look to the future. So what does this all mean for the future? Is the Corona crisis a watershed moment for philanthropy? I don't, Nina, maybe you want to start for a change?
I don't think so, honestly. I mean, this Corona crisis is a watershed moment for all of us in many respects, and I think we will have to live with the repercussions honestly, for my lifetime. I expect to somehow be influenced by it. But I think this, if you call it the basic division of powers in Germany between government and private sector, are not going to change that much. I hope that they learn to, even work, collaborate in a better way, and also to rely on each other. But I don't expect it to be a watershed moment. But ask me in about a week, because I'm going to have a big meeting with other foundations this week online, and I will ask them the same questions. And if they come up with a totally different idea, I'll let you know.
Okay. And Daniela, what are your thoughts on that? So do you see any major shifts?
I hope so. I hope so. That's what I would answer. I think that I've seen encouraging signs in that foundation pledge that I told you about earlier. In addition to all the different things foundation pledged to do, the last thing they pledged to do was learn. What can we learn from this crisis? What lessons can we take away from it to inform the future? Because I think the future is about doing better. How can we take this crisis and do better in the future? As I said, to include people who've been excluded before, to address inequalities, to improve social justice in the US, to improve environmental protection in the world. So I really hope that this is a watershed moment that leads us to better action.
Well, this has been such an informative discussion. And on behalf of 1014 and the American Council on Germany, thank you, Nina Lemmens. Thank you, Daniela Kaisth, for this incredibly thought-provoking and lively discussion. We've enjoyed it immensely. We look forward to reconvening in person, but we're grateful to both of you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
And to our viewers, and to our viewers, thank you for joining us and participating with your questions. And until next time, stay well, everyone.